Welcome to Baden Hill. Today we're going to be talking about a different part of the world. We're going to be talking about India. And we're going to try and make connections across the globe throughout the year. But right now we're thinking back on the colonization that we discussed. All of the explorers that were sent out from Europe to colonize the New World. And then we discussed the colonial period of what later became the United States. And as we talked about colonization, we saw that there were many factors. One, there was a spirit of adventure and people doing things that had never been done before. Two, there was great hardship. People who were planning to start a new world on their own often felt cut off from everyone else and in a hostile environment. And they also confronted new people, and they didn't always get along with those new people. And three, you need to know that the government and the identity that started with colonization continues today. These three factors are true whether we're talking about India or China or Africa or Vietnam. And so I hope that we can always look for the common ground as we go through our history curriculum this year. So we're going to discuss India. India, how do you do that in just a short time, in a few minutes? It's really impossible to cover everything that is rich about India's geography and culture and even religion and history in such a short time. It's impossible. But we're going to do our best to zoom through history, and we're going to start by talking about how India went from Mughals to monarchs. What you need to know is that India has long been dominated by a certain group of people, and we call them the Hindu people, and their identity is very closely tied to their religious beliefs. This goes back 4,000 years. So if we think of it in terms of the Bible and Bible history, we're talking about the time of Abraham. So the Hindu people have been in India for a long time, and the name India really is coming from that group of people and also the river that is sacred to them, the Indus River. So the Hindus, what do they believe? In a nutshell, Hinduism is about polytheism. It's about having gods everywhere, and it's about a certain understanding of the world that our goal is to be released from this physical prison that we have. And the process of being released from our physical prison is a long one, and it is essentially the rewarding of good behavior and the punishing of bad behavior. And that's what we call karma. You hear that term used a lot. And so based on karma, a person's soul can move up or move down as that soul is reborn or reincarnated. Reincarnated means made into flesh again. And so somebody who does bad could come back as a cockroach. Somebody who does good things can come back as a better and better person higher in society. This leads to a discussion of the caste system, which is a set of social levels that are established by Hinduism, and it's because of that religious belief that India has had certain levels of their society for thousands of years. On the other hand, we have another group of people in India today, and actually it's all intermixed, but after 1947, when the colony of India was divided, you basically had a Hindu section and a Muslim section, and that later became India, the Hindu section, and the Muslim section became Pakistan. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But just know that Islam came to India back in the 8th century, so really not long after Muhammad lived, and his followers spread his beliefs all over the world, especially in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, and that was an incredible movement that reached all the way to India. But it was about the 1200s that Islam was coming to India more formally. Before that, it was just merchants bringing their religion. But in the 1200s, the government started changing, and you need to know that there wasn't a unified government for India. And so you had one group that was Muslim, and that basically what happened is that group was taken over by descendants of the Mongols, and Babur is one of the most famous Mongol leaders, and he basically brought an Islamic government to India. And so the Mughals are connected to the Mongols. They're not the same, but Mughal is a word that actually means Mongol, and so there is a connection. The Mughals were Muslims, and they actually established a pretty efficient trading empire. And what they did, they were constantly seeking to expand, and we've talked about that, the idea of expansionism and imperialism going together. And so the Mughals spread throughout the whole subcontinent of India. Subcontinent means it's at the bottom of the continent, and hopefully you understand we're talking about South Central Asia. The Mughal Empire then was established roughly in the 1500s. So from the 1500s to the 1700s, the Mughals controlled India. And two famous emperors of the Mughal Empire were Akbar and Aurangzeb. Akbar is usually considered to be a positive leader who practiced religious tolerance. He got people together to talk about their ideas. He wasn't necessarily a strict Muslim in some ways because he was trying to reconcile Muslim and Hindu ideas. Some people would say it was because of his tolerance that the empire stayed together. And this is very important because we'll talk about this again and again, how especially with religions, it's very difficult to bring people together. So Akbar is seen as positive, and Aurangzeb, his grandson, is seen as negative because the empire kind of fell apart during his reign. He was a more strict Muslim from evidence in history. But there are other people who look at it and they say, Akbar, he did things that actually were pretty violent and pretty oppressive, so he wasn't always tolerant. And Aurangzeb actually was looking at a lot of the corruption and just waste of the empire to that point. And so Aurangzeb actually was very frugal. Yes, he was a strict Muslim, but some of the things that he did was they were actually to help the people of India. Well, no matter what was going on at the end of Aurangzeb's life and reign, about 50 years later, European colonization came to India. And, it was the French and the Dutch, but a very key war happened called the 7 Years' War. It was a war between England and France. And as a result, England gained the upper hand, and England was able to control India from that point forward. It's important to understand first the word Raj. The Raj refers to British rule of India. It's interesting that it's a local word. but it is seen as a foreign idea. Foreign occupation of India happened during the Raj. You can see the influence of the English on India today in terms of the national language that they have, which is English, and mainly it's to unite very diverse peoples who have a lot of different languages. In the 1850s, Victoria, Queen of England, became the Empress of India, and that largely happened because of a rebellion. We'll talk about that in the next segment. From that point forward, the structure and government of India changed. Instead of a company, which was the East India Company, that had been ruling from the 1700s all the way until the 1800s. So for a century, it had been the East India Company ruling. It changed over to a country that was being run by a civil service. And the idea was that the local people could be involved in their own government. It didn't really play out that way, and there were just a handful of native Indian people who were allowed to be civil servants. That means work in the government. One thing that you need to know is you need to know about a man named Ram Mohan Roy. And Mr. Roy was actually a reformer. He worked for the East India Company, but he actually was trying to bring together Christianity from Europe with the Hindu religious beliefs and basically create peace. And again, going back to what Akbar did, religious tolerance. He reformed Indian society because of his influence as an Indian person who also had connections to the Europeans, to the English. So his reforms included abolishing some practices that Europeans considered to be very, very bad, very immoral. One was sati. Sati is basically the custom where if the husband dies, the wife is actually killed and is burned on the husband's funeral pyre. And so sati was considered to be evil by the Christian Europeans. Child marriage was something that was being practiced, and so Roy really gets credit for reforming the Indian people. And today, those things still happen in remote parts of India, but it's much less than before. The influence of the English, we've said, was enormous, and they changed Indian government. They also changed Indian infrastructure. They built railroads and ports. They invested a lot of money because they wanted to get a lot of money from this colony. And so, you can look at it as something that the British gave to India, but you can also see it as a way for the British to control India. We need to talk next about the Sepoy Rebellion, which happened in 1857. Again, this is the reason that Queen Victoria basically took over the colony and became the Empress rather than having the colony controlled by the East India Company. So you need to know the differences between Muslims and Hindus to understand the Sepoy Rebellion, but you also need to know what they have in common. So Muslims believe that it's unlawful, wrong for them to eat pork. Hindus believe that beef is something that belongs to a sacred animal, the cow. And so both Muslims and Hindus had something that they avoided. Well, the British often disregarded local beliefs. And the problem came when the colonizers tried to use a certain kind of grease in their guns. At least that was the rumor. And all it took was a rumor that there was grease in the guns, and specifically it was in the shells that were used, and they had to tear them open with their mouth. And so the idea that there would be grease in these bullets, the ammunition, that made both Muslims and Hindus rise up in rebellion, because they thought, okay, it has to be either pig fat or cow fat, and either way, it's unclean, it's wrong. And you need to know what was going on at that time. This is before the British Army fully took over the colony. You had the East India Company with their own army, and the people working for the East India Company were called company men. Sorry, ladies, but they were company men. And there were also people called sepoys, and these were local Indian people who were recruited to be soldiers for the East India Company. So again, the company had its own army. And this crisis, this Sepoy Rebellion, basically came about because the company, they couldn't manage a country, and they were realizing that. So the Sepoy Rebellion was eventually put down in 1858, but it led to a lot of reforms within Indian society. And it also, in some people's minds, it was the beginning of a kind of movement within India to have some self-expression and self-government. This carried over all the way until the early 20th century, and I'm not going to get too far ahead of where we are in history, but just know that you need to understand the Amritsar Massacre, which happened in 1919. As India started to feel that they should have some more self-government, they created what was called the Indian National Congress, and this happened in 1885, and it was not a Congress like we think of a governing body, but it was a group that came together, Indian leaders who wanted to help Indians learn to read and write and become more developed, that kind of a thing. So it was more of a social organization, but it was moving toward a political organization. Now, what happened in the Amritsar Massacre, it's also called the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. It's a lot of words, but just know that it was a time where the British government said Indians cannot gather together and have protests or demonstrations. And this was because they were a little afraid that if a lot of Indian people got together, they'd become a mob, and there would be violence and problems. And so the British said you can't have an unlawful assembly. And this reminds us of what happened in the American Revolution, which we'll talk about later. You know, the idea that you can't assemble, that you don't have that right because your government is afraid of you. And so what happened is the Indian people on a festival day called the Baisakhi Festival, they got together, and this included Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs, who are a different group. And they were all together, and they were, meeting peacefully. But the military came in saying, this is unlawful, and suddenly they started firing rifles into the crowd. And it's clear that more than 1,000 people probably died in that massacre. Now, how did the British see this? Because obviously the Indian people were appalled. They didn't support violent uprising, but they were appalled by what happened. And the British people, there were some who were saying, wait a minute, this is out of control. We shouldn't be trying to govern a faraway country. And so the idea was planted that the British needed to give up the colony of India. But, authors, famous people like Rudyard Kipling, who wrote the Jungle Books, he basically said that the colonel's name, who was in charge of the British troops. His name was Colonel Reginald Dyer. And Rudyard Kipling said Colonel Dyer did everything he could. He did the right thing. But it's clear that he didn't. And it's clear that major mistakes were made, and as a result, 1,000 people died. This is considered the beginning of Indian nationalism. So before you had kind of an Indian consciousness and a coming together as a people with the Indian National Congress, but now you have Indian nationalism where they want to be independent and separate from the British. And that leads us to probably the most famous Indian of all time, Mohandas Gandhi. Now, that was his given name, Mohandas, but we also call him Mahatma Gandhi. That's kind of his nickname, his superhero name, because Mahatma means great soul. And he was given that name by the people because they appreciated what he was trying to do. Basically, Gandhi, he was very well trained, as he was well educated in British schools, and he actually became a lawyer. And he spent time in South Africa, which is really interesting. We usually don't realize that. And in South Africa, he was discriminated against as a non-white person, as a person of color. And so that started forming in his mind the idea that this is wrong. This treatment by the white British of the other people of color that they were governing was totally wrong, and so that became his mission in life. One of the things that he did to kind of lead people in protest when he was back in India was he led people to oppose a British law against buying their own salt. So salt had to be imported. It couldn't be local salt. And as a result, Gandhi led people to the ocean. And he said, there's salt here, collect the salt. I mean, they collected salt water, let it evaporate, and they had salt. This was seen as an act of defiance and an act of revolution. And so Gandhi faced, punishment because of that. But from this point forward, Gandhi established satyagraha, which was non-violent protest or passive resistance against this colonizing British government. And this continued where they would sit on railroad tracks and stop British trains. It continued until basically the British realized that they could not continue to govern India. And unfortunately, Gandhi's dreams of having an India that could be united, where different groups of people and different religions could come together. Again, this is Akbar's vision too, in a sense. Well, it didn't work out. He was disappointed. Eventually, he was assassinated by a Hindu. And so maybe, that person thought that Gandhi had betrayed his own people. But his legacy is one of non-violence and leadership without using force. And I think that it's profound for all of us. Now, quickly, I'm going to talk to you about one more thing that is similar to India, and this is another I country, Ireland. There are actually parallels between India and Ireland. Now, I want to talk about Ireland just very quickly. You need to know that it's divided, just like India has been. Back to the Middle Ages and beyond, you had a very Catholic, Roman Catholic country. But when the Reformation happened in the 1500s, you had a division where some people were becoming Protestant and others were Catholic. And Irish remained majority Catholic. Back to the English Civil War, where Catholics and Protestants were basically fighting each other in England, that was the time where a Protestant government was established in England, and then Ireland became more and more Protestant by force. And that led to a situation where the Irish people would be divided, and the Roman Catholic people would want their independence. And Ireland was a colony, essentially, of England, and a lot of people don't understand that. Well, at the end of the 1800s, a new idea was being discussed that, England, the UK, would allow Ireland to have some home rule. But then World War I happened, and the idea of creating home rule where the Irish could rule themselves, that started falling apart. The northern part of Ireland is known as Ulster. That is the region in the north, and that is largely Protestant. Today it's basically Northern Ireland, right? And the southern part of Ireland, that was the Catholic part. And at this time you had an uprising. In 1919 you had the Easter Rebellion or uprising, and that basically tore the country apart. It established an Irish free state in the south, but Ireland was divided, and the north has been a part of the UK ever since. There's still conflict between the Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants, so it's similar in some ways to India and the idea of a division of a country. That's true for Ireland and India and Korea and Germany in the past and places like that, for a variety of reasons. Thanks for listening to this. I know it's a little bit more information than we've had in the past, but I want you to be thinking, how are these countries similar? I want to end with one famous event that we all need to pay attention to. It's actually an event that happened twice, and it's called Bloody Sunday. Now, right away, that should make us shocked that on a Sunday you could have blood spilled. And what happened was, during the Irish Rebellion, Civil War, you had the Irish Republican Army, we call it the IRA. They attacked some of the British police, and as a result, the British police went into a soccer match in 1920, and killed people in retaliation, and that was known as Bloody Sunday. Later on in 1972, you also had a Bloody Sunday because the violence continued. It flared up again in the late 1960s and continued through the 1970s. And some people would say it's better today, but it's not fully resolved. We need to remember that, God calls us to be His people wherever we are, and violence is not the answer. That's something that I hope that we can take to heart.